I want to go now to Brendan O'Neill. He's the editor of Spiked, a website. Brendan wrote an article called "There's Something Very Ugly in This Rage Against Israel," claiming that the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism gets thinner every day. Brendan, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
So the line that you have located, or maybe not located because it does get very thin, what is that line? And is there a line that's actually been able to, you've been able to differentiate what is anti-Zionism and what is anti-Semitism?
I think it's becoming harder and harder to make that differentiation between those two things. And I think the two phenomena are becoming blurred in my mind. And you can see that on the protests against Israel. The first striking thing about the protests against Israel is that they are always angrier, they're always more visceral, they're always more irrational in some ways than protests against any other state. So there's a real double standard applied to Israeli militarism in comparison with other states' militarism. And also, often the protests go from shouting about Israel to shouting about Jewish people. And we've seen that in Paris, we've seen it in Germany, we've even seen it in London with people holding up placards saying that the Jews control the media and so on. So I'm very worried about the way in which a lot of the current protesting against Israel often seems to jump over that thin line between being anti-Zionist and being anti-Semitic.
Of course, though I understand that you're speaking to us from London, and we've spoken throughout the operation that the protests in London come every campaign, every new clash here in the Middle East. There are protests in London. Do you feel that these protests this time around on Operation Protective Edge are different than the previous ones?
Well, there was a huge protest in 2009 in Hyde Park, which was attended by thousands of people, and I went to that as a reporter to see what was going on. And I saw some very shocking things there as well. I mean, there was one shocking incident where a man was wearing a caricatured Jew mask, and he was pretending to eat dead babies. And what was most shocking for me about that is that everyone else was just walking past him as if this was an entirely normal thing for someone to do. And that's when I started to think, back in 2009, that there is this increasingly thin line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But I do think it's becoming more pronounced. I do think in the demonstrations, not only in London, but also across Europe, it's becoming more obvious to me that the rage against Israel is about something else. It's very emotional. It's often quite unhinged. It's like a screaming, it's a venting of rage against various different things which are attached onto Israel. And I think that's why it's an unstable political sentiment which can quite easily collapse into being something prejudiced in nature.
But many will also argue that this time around the international media has served or tried to correct their mistakes of the past and tried to take a more objective line in covering the Israeli-Gaza conflict. We, of course, know that the BBC in the beginning did a whole story about how pictures were being doctored or taken from other conflicts and put in. Do you see an opposite trend, perhaps, that, yes, protesters on the street are going to one direction, but actually the international media may be trying to, recorrect itself?
I think the media is sensitive to the accusation that in past conflicts it has been one-sided. It's been extremely critical of Israel. It's often, in fact, published material itself that has turned out to be fake or doctored or false. So this time around, I think they're more sensitive to that, and probably they're trying to do something about it. But at the same time, there are still a number of problems. I do think the Western media is far more critical of Israel than it is of other states that get involved in military conflicts. That seems undeniable to me. And you're right, the BBC made an effort to pinpoint where there is inaccurate photographs and coverage of what's happening in Gaza. But at the same time, let's not forget that one of the BBC's leading correspondents tweeted a photograph that he said was from Gaza and later had to apologize because it turned out that it was from Syria. So I think there is still a tendency among journalists to use what is called the journalism of attachment, a very emotional form of journalism. They are extremely sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians, and they're extremely hostile to the existence of Israel in some cases. And I do think that's still coming through in some of the mainstream coverage.
And it's important to note also that you do in your article say why haven't the British public come out of over David Cameron's ordering airstrikes on Libya and so forth. comparing the conflicts many times will warrant a response, and I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, that just because you can compare conflicts doesn't make what Israel is doing right. Is that a concrete argument that you would stand by?
Well, I think that what's interesting to me is lots of the people who criticize Israel or who march against Israel will say that they're just doing it for the victims. They're worried about the fact that women and children and civilians are being killed. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to be concerned about. What I'm interested in is why they don't have the same concern in relation to other conflicts, because there is hardly a single conflict in recent history in which women and children and other civilians have not been killed. That includes Britain's attack on Libya. It obviously includes America and Britain's attacks on Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, there were some protests against those conflicts, not against Libya, by the way, but they were much less passionate than the protests against Israel. They were much more controlled. They had much more of a political sentiment to them. What I find very striking about Israel is not only that there are more protests against it than there are against our own governments when our own governments do bad, but also that the protests are much crazier and intense and fuming and furious. And I'm really keen to know why that is. And I think it's because Israel has been turned into the symbol of evil that all sorts of people in the West can rail against and rage against and feel good while they do it.
Brandon, what kind of responses did you get for this editorial? Obviously, as you said, it's a very passionate subject, one that does rile up emotions from either side. What kind of responses did you get? Anything, out of the ordinary?
I've had a huge number of positive responses from, I suppose, from friends of Israel, from people in Israel. More positive responses in relation to this piece than I've probably had in relation to many other things I've written. But I've also had hate mail and people saying nasty things and calling me a Zionist groveler and, a suck-up to the Zionist state and all those kind of things that you tend to expect when you write about this issue. But the most surprising thing for me is the number of people who responded by saying, it's about time someone said this, because I think this kind of problem is on people's minds, the problem of the increasingly thin line between what poses as an anti-Israel sentiment, but which often expresses itself as something that is borderline anti-Semitic. That's a problem I think lots of people are concerned about and struggling to understand. And I think people are quite relieved that it's finally being discussed, I hope, and I think it should be discussed even further.